As Congress closes in on a deal to cut taxes, Craig Gilbert talks to Wisconsin residents for their views. We get the debrief from Craig. And have we finally heard the end of the John Doe investigation into Scott Walker and the Republicans? Jason Stein brings us up to date. Back in Milwaukee, is there any realistic way that city government can use fewer contractors in the wake of a racist incident involving one of them? All that and more today from the best political reporters in Wisconsin on OnPolitics. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Haynes, the opinions editor at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. I'm joined by Dan Bice, a columnist for the Journal-Sentinel, and Mary Spacuzza, and we have some breaking news today. Politico is reporting on its website this morning that Paul Ryan, the House Speaker from Janesville, has made it known, quote, to some of his closest confidants that this will be his final term as Speaker, and they go on to report that he doesn't plan to run in 2018. Dan, Mary, pick up on that.
He was asked this question this morning, whether he was going to be stepping down soon. He said no, and then immediately walked away. A couple of his advisors are pushing back and being dismissive of this article, but it looks like there's at least some truth to it. In the story, they said they talked to more than a dozen people that he had discussed this with, and we've heard from one Republican that this story is true. So it's a pretty, this is coming as he's nearing the finish line on his major bill, the Republican tax overhaul. The story says he wants to stick around and go after one more issue, which is entitlement reform. But this would throw a number of things.
The other white whale, it says. So Mary, Paul Ryan can't, even if he's planning to do this, can't really say it, right? Because he'd lose a lot of political
Right, he doesn't want to
capital.
look like a lame duck speaker who has no control.
Which would kill his fundraising too, right?
Sure.
And he's been a good fundraiser, very good fundraiser for Congress.
Yeah, he has, for his own campaign, for other campaigns, and for Republican congressional campaigns. So I'd honestly be more surprised if he didn't run for re-election at all, just because he's been in Congress for so long. He could go to a think tank, probably a conservative think tank, I would think. But, he's been in Congress for, half of his life.
Years.
Yeah, so
98.
The speaker thing, he never wanted it in the first place. He was pretty clear about that. It does sound like it's a pretty miserable, thankless job. So would it kill him to give that up? It would certainly be a loss of power for him, but I don't know that he's really loving working with President Trump. They've obviously had a troubled relationship. He can't seem to win on whether he backs Trump or goes against Trump. I guess I wouldn't be that surprised if he stepped away from Speaker. I'd be more surprised if he's done.
And a whole bunch of tough stuff coming up over the next few weeks. Debt ceiling increase, fund the government, you name it. A lot of unpleasant things, especially for a Republican.
He's
going to have to cut deals.
Right. And, if he is stepping away and people think this, he might be able to work out deals with some Democrats on a few of these things, because there are going to be Republicans who push back on the debt ceiling and some of these other things.
Now, there's talk in the article, Mary, about his own father died when he was 55. I think Paul found him.
Yeah.
And so he suffered through that. And there's talk of him wanting to spend time with his kids as they're getting into their teenage years. He's 48, I think, now, or will be by that time.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Does that make sense based on what you know about Paul Ryan?
He's been very open about wanting to spend weekends with his family, about being
Flies
back
back
in
almost every
Janesville.
weekend.
I think pretty much every weekend, yeah. He does have young children. His wife has obviously been kind of single parenting Monday through Friday as he's in D.C. every week. So, that would also.
The one important thing to remember here is this: he's coming closer to having a major victory. He's not had very many of these things. The House has passed stuff by itself, and it either didn't get through the Senate or Obama blocked it or whatever. But this is. He's getting very close to having a major accomplishment.
The tax bill.
Yeah, right. The tax bill. And if you ask what is his second biggest major accomplishment after that, you can't think of very many. Obamacare, that didn't work. A number of other things the House passed, but it just didn't get beyond that. And he, when meeting with the editorial board not long ago, earlier this year, acknowledged that he hadn't accomplished a whole lot. But this would be major for him. Somebody's likened it to to John Boehner's Pope moment, that when he had his major meeting where he got to bring the Pope in, introduce him to Congress, the next day he announced he was retiring. So it's similar where he's getting his moment in the sun with the tax overhaul.
Isn't it also possible that this is a story that might have sort of been planted by people who want Ryan gone?
Sure, there is also that the close confidants could be people who want him to be stepping down and don't want him to be speaker anymore.
But a lot of these, but there were speculative pieces before this, and they all seem to be quoting Republicans. And this story talks about members of his kitchen cabinet. So it's not like, first of all, he wouldn't want this out there right now. So I think, reading the story, I don't think there was, to me, it didn't look like that there was anything to doubt. It was heavily reported. They talked to a number of people. It is speculative. They don't say definitively he is not running for re-election. He is stepping down as speaker. That's not in there, but it's very, very close to saying that.
All right. Well, let's go now to Craig Gilbert, whom I talked to a bit earlier today. Craig's on the road doing some more reporting for his project on political polarization. We talked to Craig about the tax bill. Craig, welcome back to OnPolitics. You are on the road talking to people about the Republican tax bill, which there's news this morning that the House and Senate conferees have reached an agreement, probably will get passed next week. What are you hearing from people out in Wisconsin and outstate in Wisconsin?
Yeah, I just spent 3 days in south central Wisconsin, Juneau County, which is an interesting area because it's very white and blue collar. It's economically challenged. And it had the biggest shift from Obama to Trump of any county in Wisconsin last year. But, what I found that may not be too surprising is there's really limited understanding and a fair amount of skepticism about the Republican tax cuts. People aren't really sure how it's going to affect them, if it's going to do them much good, including Trump voters. They're kind of jaded about Congress right now, especially after the failure of Republicans to do anything on health care. And so, it's not the issue that's front of mind for people. It's a lesser issue than health care. People are hearing, in some cases, negative things about the bill being tilted for wealthier people. And it's just not a sense that it's going to have a dramatic impact on people's lives.
Craig, do you have any sense that Trump voters that you've talked to would hold Trump responsible if the tax bill ends up not being good for them?
Well, I think to some degree that skepticism is really aimed at Congress right now, including Republican leadership. Some Trump voters are frustrated at the Republicans' inability to get things done. And to some degree, I think the danger for Republicans is that the failure on health care, locked in this perception that Congress can't get anything done. And so the question is whether success in passing a tax bill, which I think is a lesser issue than health care, is going to change that. I think that's a very open question.
Well, let's talk about another concern that Republicans have in the wake of the election in Alabama. Roy Moore lost, and a Democrat won for the first time in years in that state. What's your take on what happened in Alabama and how that affects both the ability of Paul Ryan to lead the House now going forward, not the Senate, of course, the House, but also Trump's prospects going into a big mid-term election next year?
Yeah, I don't think anybody thinks Alabama's turning blue, but this was a pretty extreme example of the perils Republicans face when it comes to their own internal divisions. We saw something like this a few years ago when Tea Party candidates were winning Republican primaries, and it turned out that they weren't general election candidates. The danger, again, here for Republicans, if this is a cycle where they have a really rare opportunity to knock off a lot of Democratic Senate incumbents in states that voted for Trump. And, they could be undercutting their own chances if kind of hardcore sort of candidates are winning primaries, less electable in general elections, especially if it's a poor political climate in terms of President Trump's approval ratings. And in the short term, it also obviously cuts the margin, a very thin margin to begin with in the Senate, which we saw was the undoing of the health care bill. Now it's an even thinner margin for Republicans going forward.
All right, Craig Gilbert, on the road in Madison, thanks so much.
Great to be with you.
So now let's go to a segment with Jason Stein in Madison about the John Doe report that the Attorney General, Brad Schimmel, released last week. So, Jason, it seems like the John Doe investigation into Scott Walker and the Conservatives actually never seems to end, even when it does end. We had a report in recent days from the Attorney General, Brad Schimmel, a Republican, that reopened all of that. What's the fallout from that, and what might happen next?
Well, there are some things in politics, at least in Wisconsin politics, that really don't have an end, and that John Doe is one of them, foremost among them. I mean, it's worth noting that investigation started, in 2010, and then went on in a couple stages for years. And then there was, a backlash to that of conservatives saying, look, this thing has become a fishing expedition, a witch hunt. And since then, there's been, several years of litigation, more over the John Doe. I mean, the John Doe has been shut down for years, but continues to trigger litigation at both the state and federal level. And that's where this Attorney General report comes in.
And talk a little bit about what Schimmel, sort of in a nutshell, what Schimmel was saying in that report. It was pretty damning for the former agency, the Government Accountability Board, wasn't it?
Right. So there was a special prosecutor in the case. The investigation came out of the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office, and because it involved campaign finance laws, the state elections agency at the time, the Government Accountability Board, also got involved. What the Attorney General found was that the evidence that, a very broad and extensive amount of evidence was collected during these probes. He found that it was not guarded or sort of protected with the sort of usual safeguards that law enforcement would use, both when it was at the Government Accountability Board, but also when it was being held at the state Supreme Court, which had sort of shut down the investigation and made the authorities turn over all this information that they had collected. And so the Attorney General is recommending contempt of court charges against a number of people involved in the investigation, and lawyer ethics sanctions against one of the key attorneys at the elections agency that was involved in the case.
There's also a question of who leaked some of the information from the John Doe investigation to The Guardian, the UK newspaper, correct?
Right. I managed to leave out the most important thing, so thank you for telling me that. Obviously, what was the germination of this AG's report is that the Guardian newspaper got some information that was damaging to Scott Walker and Republicans that was leaked, clearly leaked in some way out of this investigation. And what the Attorney General found was that his investigators believe that the information somehow came out of the Government Accountability Board because they believe only that agency really had all the documents in question during the investigation, but they could never pin down, in part because the evidence wasn't really locked down and controlled very well. They couldn't pin down who might have had access to it and leaked it. So there were no criminal charges brought as part of the investigation for the leak.
Yeah, and we should also point out that Shane Falk, one of the attorneys at the GAB that you mentioned, has said he did nothing wrong, and he's sort of denied any problems with it. Or the way they handled the evidence.
Right.
But
and, I mean, it's clear that someone leaked the information because it didn't just magically get to the Guardian. I mean, it is worth noting that This is an investigation that it was a sprawling investigation, had many targets. The targets had many attorneys, the people work in the attorney's offices. Many, court agencies had access to information. So, I mean, it was certainly not an easy task for the AG's office to go and track down, who it was that did leak this.
So the never-ending investigation, once thought over, but what's the fallout now? What might happen next here?
Sure. Well, a couple of things. One, the state court will have to decide whether or not to issue these contempt of court sanctions, and the lawyer ethics sanctions will have to be resolved as well. The judge that was supposed to decide that, I discovered that he had been tweeting about the case and sort of giving opinions about the case over a period of years in dozens of tweets. And so he ended up stepping away from the case. And so now another judge will be appointed and do that. And then, there is some ongoing federal litigation over this case. And, it's at least possible that the targets of the probe who brought that litigation may be able to use some of this information to further their case. So we'll see about that in the coming months.
All right, Jason Stein in Madison, thanks so much for that update.
Thank you, David.
Now I'm back with Mary and Dan. And Dan, on the John Doe, you're about to report something on that.
Right. One, as you said, this story never goes away. It's been going on since I first wrote my first story on it in August of 2010. I'm going to write that the one Milwaukee County prosecutor who's identified in the Schimmel report that he recommends disciplinary action against him probably doesn't worry about this too much, since he's recently retired and collected an $811,000 backdrop from Milwaukee County. So a pretty good deal for him. I asked him how he's going to use it. He said basically none of your business.
All right. So, Mary, let's move to this question of city contractors. We had this really ugly incident in the last few days involving a city contractor where some of them were wearing guns, one flashing a gun, and that same group, one of the guys apparently had a KKK sticker on a cooler. And now some aldermen are saying, well, why do we even have to have contractors? So realistically, what's the answer?
So that worker was fired by American Sewer Services. They said that they were outraged, did not support it. It was a sticker with a Confederate flag sticker, but then a Ku Klux Klan sticker under that. And the photograph circulated on Friday, which was really just a few days after the photo of the workers with guns from the same company at a different site. So there's been concern about, one, city contractors carrying guns. City workers are not allowed to. Obviously, it can bring up some liability issues for the city. And also, you have a photo of white contractors in a predominantly black neighborhood in Milwaukee, and raising questions about, do they always carry those guns or just when they're in certain neighborhoods. The KKK sticker, that gentleman was fired apparently. They're going to bring that contractor to a committee. It was going to be today. They've pushed that back until next week to have them answer some questions. I think the contractor has a number of contracts with the city and wants to keep those contracts and is insisting that they want to work with the city to build trust. But in the meantime, a couple of aldermen are saying, like, maybe we should train city workers to do these jobs so we're not working with outside contractors. That's tricky because, some of these contracts are for very specific things that wouldn't necessarily sustain permanent city employees, but they need somebody to do X, Y, or Z. And so they do contracts for highly specialized work or work that wouldn't be year-round work. But I do think it's interesting to think about if something for a long-term project, maybe is it cheaper, is it more efficient, and do you have more control over the workers if it is a city staffer as opposed
That's
to
a debate that's been going on for a long time at the city and state level, right? So.
And so I think that in the meantime, that contractor is clearly trying to show that this is not the opinion of the company and more a couple of problem workers. I'm not aware of other problems with that company in addition to these incidents, but we'll certainly be looking into it.
Okay.
I think that's an interesting question about whether you should be doing that sort of contract. But you're right, many of these things are small, but all governments are in the business of infrastructure and creating sustaining infrastructure, which is a costly business. I mean, and there's a debate whether it would be cheaper for the public sector to do it or the private sector. And I assume a lot of people don't want the public sector competing with the private sector on things that they are specialists in.
But like clearly the city of Milwaukee has a lot of work to do on lead and lead pipes and lead pipe removal. And is that something that we're going to be doing for so long because there are so many houses that do we keep working with contractors as planned, or do city workers get more involved in projects like that?
Okay, well, we'll probably hear more about that particular debate. Let's move on to our winners and losers for this week. Mary, I want to go to you first. Who's your loser of the week?
I'm going to say losers, Roy Moore and his wife Kayla.
And Kayla. As a matter of fact, we have some video of Kayla from earlier this week.
Fake news would tell you that we don't care for Jews. I tell you all this because I've seen it all, so I just want to set the record straight while they're here. One of our attorneys is a Jew. We had very close friends that are Jewish and rabbis, and we also fellowship with them.
So, Mary, why are the Moores your loser of the week?
So you've got someone who lost a race, who's refusing to concede and admit that they lost. His wife clearly had some pretty pointed comments about everybody except for, there's the fake news. She had some pretty controversial comments about Jews, African Americans, that really seemed to backfire against her and kind of have a different message than she was trying to send, clearly.
And we had our own former Sheriff Clark down there campaigning for him, saying that the fate of the Republic turned on Roy Moore getting elected, so we should be careful for what might happen now.
And it was interesting because there was extremely high, a lot of African American women turned out to vote, not for Roy Moore, obviously, a lot of African American men, a lot of Republicans kind of sat that one out, it seemed like, or did write-ins.
22,000 write-ins, yeah.
Yeah, so he clearly inspired people who did not like him to get to the polls and who far preferred his opponent, who is now going to be heading off to D.C., whether or not he can.
But we'll get a challenge. Yeah, the big question is, can he hold on to the seat?
Right, it's only 2 years, I think, right? 2020.
Right.
So, all right, that's your loser. Who's your winner this week?
So our winner was a little unusual. There's an interesting story on our site about a Marine named Fred, who's 95 years old, who apparently beat down and tackled and wrestled a robber with the help of his daughter, who was trying to steal his wallet and broke into his house and threatened him and his daughter, and they were able to chase him down, and it sounds like chased him through about 12 yards, I think, knocking on doors, calling for neighbors to call the police, and the man was arrested, and apparently once a Marine, always a Marine.
You don't mess with a Marine
and
ever,
yes.
even at age 95. That's a great story.
Exhibit A.
Exhibit A. So, Dan, who's your winner of the week?
Well, I chose Paul Ryan before all this news started breaking just because he's so close to his biggest political victory. And just to be clear, the story is evolving. It seems the position of Team Ryan is that the Politico story is speculative and they're not confirming it, but other people are saying that there might be truth to it. So, throughout the day today, I think it's going to be developing.
And it sounds like Ryan, as he was walking out of his news conference today, asked if he was going to be stepping down soon. He kind of shot a no as he walked out, and they're citing that. But it's also kind of a big question. Soon, like this year, soon? I mean, he could say, well, 2019 is a long time away. So that's kind of gives him a little bit of wiggle room.
If you asked him, are you running for re-election, you would have gotten, it'd be hard for him to answer that with, much waffle room. So
soon is a bit, yeah.
Right.
But I think again, his staff nobody wants to be seen as a lame duck speaker or lame duck congressman, and so whether or not he was stepping down, it kind of makes sense that his staff would say he's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So
It might be more to come on that story. We'll see. Who's the loser of the week, Dan?
My loser, I try to stay local, but in this case, I went national. I chose Steve Bannon. He was all in with the Roy Moore race and saw it as the first step in his attacking the Republican establishment in Washington, and he came up short. He predicted on Monday, I believe, that Moore would win by 5 to 10 points. So that obviously didn't happen. The repercussions around the country will be interesting especially here, because Kevin Nicholson has aligned himself with Bannon. So we need to watch how that plays out in his race against Leah Vukmir for the U.S. Senate.
So is Trump likely to continue to take Bannon's advice? It hasn't worked out so well lately.
Well, Donald Trump's going to take advice from anybody who he thinks can make him a winner. And if Bannon's the guy to do it, he'll use him. If Bannon's not the guy, he'll throw him by the wayside.
All right. Well, we have time for a couple of questions. This one, I think we could all try to tackle. This is from Adam, who says, is it just me, or is media fabricating a lot more stories? Is it due to bad sourcing, bad writing, lack of fact-checking, or just plain fabrication? Why is this happening, and how does the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel check its stories, even when it comes from a national news source? Who wants to start on that one?
I think what's happening is each mistake, no matter how big or how small, that the national media makes, the Trump administration will highlight, and they have a megaphone to call attention to it. Some of the mistakes have been major, like the Brian Ross story. That was terrible, and he ends up getting suspended for a month. Some of them are incredibly minor, like the picture that the Washington Post staffer took of the place where Trump was giving his speech.
Didn't he just retweet it? Wasn't it
And then it was taken down. Mm-hmm. So it was a very different thing. But the response in each of these occasions by Trump is that the person should be fired. So I think more people are aware of when these things happen. And reporters make mistakes. I've made mistakes. We've all made mistakes. Yeah. The only thing is, right now, that we've got a president with his focus right now 24/7 on anything related to Trump. And I think part of it is also that the Trump administration is not very transparent. So we just had the resignation of the staffer who
Omarosa?
Right. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of stories about what happened there.
Was she escorted out? Did she quit? Was she dragged out screaming?
And the official message is that she gave her resignation, and she leaves January 20th. Well, almost everybody else is reporting stories saying it isn't that simple, that there was a whole lot of stuff going on. So I think, if you can't get it officially, you have to try to get it unofficially. And sometimes that's when you run into problems.
I would point out that reputable news organizations correct their errors publicly with the names of the reporter who made the mistake on them. Organizations that aren't reputable often don't do that.
I would question the premise that there's been this, explosion of fabricated stories. I think the Washington Post story where they tracked down the fake tipster who was actually seems to be aligned and paid by a conservative media outlet, the James O'Keefe, which isn't really journalism. But I would say their fact-checking and the way they chased that down and didn't buy her story kind of showed the fact-checking that goes into a lot of stories at major news organizations.
Can you talk just for a second to close the loop on it, Mary, about how you fact-check a story? What do you do to make sure a story is accurate before publication?
I've been accused of OCD fact-checking. So traditionally what I would do is, I can't say I do it with every story, but typically with any kind of major one or one where I think there will be questions, I tend to print it out, go to every primary basically any kind of fact, underline it, and then go to a primary source to fact check that. That could be a name, spelling, a title, where they work, and I try to will literally underline it and check each fact. That's not something I do if I'm on breaking deadline, and I might post something and then clarify it as I get more information. But I rarely, it's the whole if your mother says she loves you, check it out thing, is that you don't take much for granted.
And I would point out, too, that after any story is filed or put up online at the Journal Sentinel or in print, it gets read by at least one editor and often more than one.
Right. It takes a village to get a news story
and to get it right.
Right.
So. All right. Well, that's it for today's show. Dan Bice, Mary Spacuzza, thanks so much for being with us. Same to Craig Gilbert and Jason Stein. I'm David Haynes with the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Thanks for joining us on Politics.